Hello everyone, my name is Dean and welcome back to part 3 and the finale of the Ransack Gem series. Today we're going to be using a scope to create a custom SQL query that we use to search for IP addresses in remote machines, which sounds a lot more complicated than it will be. Basically, the first 60% of the video will just be set up to get us a Rails application that has the stuff that we're going to search through. And then we're going to add like 10 or 20 lines of code to do the custom scope. It's actually fairly simple to do that. But what it will allow us to do is to sort IP addresses, which of course can be a difficult problem because you might have IP addresses that, have missing zeros in the padding because it might be like 192.168.001. If you try to cast that to an integer, that 001, those digits are significant. You can't just drop them off. And if you're just using basic IP addresses, of course, that padding won't be there, and then your number becomes smaller than it actually is. So it'll mess up your sorting. So we're going to be using Postgres and the INet data type, which will allow us to do our sorting that way. Now, as far as searching goes, there's no way for us to do that through Ransack by default, but what we can do is use Ransack's scopes to allow us to create a custom SQL query where we can first cast the IP address to a string, and then we can do our search on that string just like we would before. So we're going to cover that. Won't take too long, hopefully. Hopefully you'll get something out of this. Hopefully it'll be helpful. But that's enough from me. Let's go ahead and let's jump into some code. Okay, so we're going to start with a brand new Rails app today. This is a very basic app, just ran a new Rails command. And we're going to go from there. So we're going to start off by actually generating a new scaffold. So I'll say Rails G scaffold machine. I'll give each machine a name, and I'll give each machine an IP address. Now the name will be of type string by default, but the IP address we're actually going to make of type INet. This is, I think, is specific to Postgres. I'm not sure if other databases have this. But this essentially allows you to store your IP address as an IPv4 or an IPv6. And it does come with some special logic associated with it, which makes searching and sorting it a little bit easier. So we'll run this scaffold, and hopefully this will generate. Looks like it did. And then we can run, I believe, a Rails. Actually, I need to set up my database, so we're not going to run anything else. So we'll just leave that alone for now. And then we'll come over to our config and our database.yaml file. And for this development one, we're actually going to replace this. So we'll say this needs an adapter for PostgreSQL. It is a database, and I'll just call this IP filter video. Then we'll give it a user of Postgres. And this is just what I have mine set to. A password of password, a host of host, a port, and by default, Postgres makes that 5432. We'll give it a timeout of 5,000 because why not? And then we'll give it a pool of 5. Then we have to add this to our gem file. So let's go ahead and let's open up our gem file. If I click on the right thing. And then in our gem file, we'll just add a few gems. We'll say gem PG. Then we'll say gem ransacked. I think ransacked. Let me check my notes to make sure. No, it's just ransack. And then we'll say gem faker. And that's just for some of the seeded data that we're going to be using. So now we can run a bundle install. That should install our gems. And now I think we can do a Rails DB create. This should hopefully create our database. Looks like it did. And then we should be able to do a Rails DB :migrate command to migrate our database. And now we can come into our db seeds.rb file, and we can try to seed this. So we'll say 50.times do, and then end. And then we can say machine.create. We'll give each machine a name. And for this, we can use the faker gem because that comes with some stuff. And for this, let's actually do, I don't know, internet.url. That works. So we're not really using it as a name. This is just going to put a random website in there that's hopefully fake. Hopefully I'm not sending you anywhere strange. And then the next one is going to be for the IP address, and we can also use faker for this. So we'll say faker internet.ip_v4.address. And if we spell address right, we clean up the rest of our code. We should then be able to run a Rails db:/seed command to seed our database. Lowercase seed, my finger slipped. Should be seeding it now. That looks good. So let's go ahead and let's open up our console. And then let's grab our machine.first. And then if we do this .ip, we should be able to see a IPv4 in here. And you can see it's in this format here. And a lot of this is going to be handled by Postgres as we move forward. So the next thing we can do is we can actually come over to our controllers and our machines controller, and we'll set up our Ransack. So in here, we just have 2 lines again. So say @q equals machine.ransack. We want to ransack with the q parameter. Then we can say @machines equals @q.result, and we'll say distinct should be true. That takes care of our controller logic. The next thing we can do is we can come over and create a search form. So we'll say views, machines, we'll create a new file in here, and we'll create a partial, call it search form.html.erb. Make sure it has the leading underscore so we get that Rails partial goodness. And then let's create a Ruby tag, and we'll say search form for @q do f. And this is just a helper provided by Ransack. And then we, of course, need to say end. We don't need the equals there. And then in here, what we can do is we can say this needs a f.label for the name contains. So this is where we'll say the name of the machine contains something. And then we'll say f.search field for the name cont. And this is where the name cont was something we covered in episode 1. It's just saying, name contains blah, blah, blah. But we also want to be able to search by IP addresses. So for this, we can say f.label. We'll do the same thing. We'll say the IP should, let's say the IP should equal something, right? That sounds good enough. But then how do we search this? Well, to search it, we can just say f.search field IP search. Then we'll give this a f.submit, and we should be good to go. But instead of submit, we'll just leave it like that for now. So let's come over to our index.html.erb page, because this is where we have to do some more setup. Now for the name, we can do the same thing we did last time. So we'll say sort link, and we want @q with :name. We'll say name as the thing it should say, and then we'll give it a default order of ASC. Just full screen this because we're getting a little bit messy here. We'll close the parentheses, add a space. That looks good. And then for the IP, we can say sort link @q IP address, something like that. And that should work just fine. Now we want to come up here, and we do also want to render our partial. So say machines/search form, something like that. So now let's actually come in here and let's go to our routes.rb, and let's do a route to the machines index page. Save that, looks good. Refresh this, and I'll move this over. And if I actually start the Rails server, I can hopefully watch everything blow up, because it's trying to do this thing called the IP search. So if I come into the search form, this thing saying IP search, let me change this to IP contains undefined local variable IP. And this is in the sort link. So let me come into the index page. This needs to have a colon in front of it. Let me refresh again. Should be compiling. Looks good. Okay, so inside our name, we have a whole bunch of random info. And then for our IP, we have a whole bunch of random info. So let me scroll down here. I'll create a new machine. I will call this testable, and I'll give it an IP of 192.168.0.1. Hit create, I'll hit back, and now let's try to sort this. So if I sort by name, you can see the testable appears here if I sort appropriately. If I try to sort by IP address, this should actually, by default. Okay, well, I wasn't really expecting that to work, so now I'm just going to improvise this a little bit. So let's pretend that the IP searching and sorting didn't work, and you wanted to add a custom logic for that, and you wanted to hear a TikTok sound go off in the background because I'm incredibly unprofessional. So assuming that's what you wanted, what we could do then is we could come over to our models and our machine.rb, and we could full screen this. And in here, we could add a scope. And the scope allows us to do some custom search logic. So for example, oh, actually, it looks like the sorting's not the thing that should be not working. It might be the searching. So let me try to do a 192 in the search. Yeah, okay, the search doesn't work. Okay, gotcha. I've caught up to where I was in the tutorial. So this is good. So the way that we can make the searching work, if we actually use our brains, is we can add a custom scope to the model. So if we come in here and we say this needs a scope, we'll call this IP search. And we'll pass this a function that just has a queue. And this is just our query. So when we call IP search, we want to query or pass in our input query, and we want to do something with this. What we can do is we can actually call some SQL stuff here or some helpers. So for example, the where helper. Oops, the where helper. And we can say where. So when we have an IP, I want to call some SQL on the IP. So maybe I want to say, I don't know, let's convert this to text because we're searching it. So we'll say text parentheses IP. And then because we're using Postgres, we want to say I like instead of like. And then we want to do single quotes. And inside those single quotes, we'll say percent hash brace q brace percent. And now right around now is usually where someone's going to say something like, well, you should really be using an RL query or whatever it's called, because that's the more proper way to do it. That is true. However, this is just a example about Ransack. I'm not necessarily going to get into, creating tables and stuff like that for your queries. So if you want to just pass in raw SQL and you're not worried about, SQL injections or any of that, this will work just fine. So how you use this now is when you call this method, the scope, you actually need to give it a scope. So let's save this. So if I try to run this, we actually need to come into our form, I believe. So our search form, we want to change this from IP contains to IP underscore search. And that's just because that's what we called it in here. So here it says IP search. So we want our search form to be the same. So let me bump this up a little bit. So now if we refresh this page, you'll see undefined method IP search, blah, 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 machine base. So, okay, our IP search isn't defined. So why is our scope not working? Well, unfortunately, we need to actually add this to ransacked or our ransackable scopes. The way you do this is by defining a method. So it's going to be def self dot. And we say ransackable scopes. And you can pass in an auth object if you want to. Underscore auth underscore object equals nil by default. And then what we can say, we basically need to return something, and we just want to return an array that has IP search in it. And I believe if we do that, now things should start to work. So let's take one of these numbers. I guess we'll take 81, and there should only be a single 81 in here. So I'll search for 81, and there's our 81 as the leading number. Now, what if I wanted to do 81.102? You can see here it starts to work just like you would expect it to. I can also grab 102, and we get a couple of these, but here's our 81.102. So what if I just grab this? You can see here we're grabbing this entire IP address just like we would expect. Now I created a couple extra testables, so I can search for testable as well. But again, just like last time, combining these two is going to lead to some weird, funky behavior. So what I can do is say 192.168.0.2, and I can hit search. This actually seems to be working just fine. I might be full of beans, as one of my coworkers would say. But that is basically the gist of how you would do a more advanced scope query like this. So all you really have to do that's different from before is inside your search form, you just add in your search field, you call that custom method, you come into your model, you give it a scope, you name the scope whatever you want, you pass in your query, and then you do whatever you want to with it for your SQL logic. And then you just add in the scope to your ransackable scopes. And this really allows you to expand Ransack to whatever you need in just a couple lines of code. Really, most of this episode was just setting up the application that we were going to run the ransacked stuff in. The actual ransacked code is, just a couple lines. So that's really helpful. I really do think this is good. It's just, when you start to try and combine some of your SQL logic, you can, it kind of becomes a pain because you're writing more SQL than you are just using ransacked helpers. And at that point, you should just really roll your own search engine, not try to build off of some gem like this, because that's not really the point of the gem. But that's going to do it for me. Let's go ahead and let's jump to the outro video. Okay, and that's going to do it for this small little Ransack series. I don't know if you can notice, but it's about 90 degrees in here. It's been pretty hot recently. I'm very shiny. But hopefully this series helped and this video helped. And if it did, don't forget to subscribe and all the other YouTube jazz. I think the next thing I'll probably be taking a look at is the PG search, which is specific to Postgres search. And if you're interested in some Postgres specific tutorials, I can also cover that. Just let me know in the comments down below if a Postgres tutorial series is something you'd be interested in. I can cover everything from setting it up with Rails to how to actually just straight up use Postgres, which of course you can use with other languages and stuff like that. Just let me know in the comments down below. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video.